Hello, and welcome to a slide program presented by myself, Carla Wulfsberg, and
John Ceazan.
John and I are residents of Thurston County, and we're volunteers on a team that follows and analyzes the activities and decisions made by commissioners at the Port of Olympia. Our team is called the Port of Olympia Action Team, and we're sponsored by Olympia Indivisible. We hope that the information in this presentation will help to inform you about the Port of Olympia and to assist you as you vote for 3 new port commissioners on the November ballot. We'll take a look back in time in our state's history before there were public ports and acquaint you with how public ports came to exist. Then we'll offer some history about the beginning and evolution of the Port of Olympia, a Thurston County-wide government agency. We'd also like to present a number of issues of public concern, some of which also resonated with citizens in Washington state over a century ago. Some of those same issues continue to concern citizens today about the Port of Olympia. And in conclusion, we'll present 6 candidates running for port commissioners and their priorities if elected. Long before European settlers arrived, the Coast Salish people paddled and sailed the waterways of Budd Inlet and Puget Sound for their transportation and trading. They fished and gathered shellfish in these local waters. These were the ancestors of the Squaxin Island and the Nisqually tribes. Budd Inlet was a transfer point for these Native Americans as they made their way from Puget Sound to southern destinations and the Columbia River. As Europeans arrived, they too depended on water as the most convenient method for basic transportation of people and goods. Early settlers often chose locations to live near deep water ports and navigable waterways. The cities of Olympia and Tumwater were no exception. Here's an artist's rendition of the Olympia waterfront and the Deschutes estuary in 1879. And the arrow on the right points to what was then a very small peninsula in Olympia reaching north. But if you look to the upper left, you'll see the Deschutes estuary, and just follow it off to the left and you'll find Tumwater Falls. In 1889, the new state constitution declared that these beds of navigable waterways belonged to the people and gave the legislature power to designate which of those beds would become harbors. The history of public ports in Washington is closely associated with railroads, private railroad companies, private sawmills, timber yards, and other industries that grew to dominate ports. Railroads controlled not only ports, but also controlled shipping rates and wharf availability, promoting their own interests over local economic development. This photograph of the Tacoma waterfront in the late 1890s shows a wheat elevator built by the Puget Sound flouring mill, and it's an example of how railroads and private industries grew to cut off physical access to the waterfront. Ships from around the globe would load flour from this North Tacoma dock. Since most cities were dependent on trade, the move to create public ports was a contentious struggle with the railroads. Cities owed much of their growth to the railroads. They gave away huge tracts of land in the hope the Northern Pacific would choose their town as the western terminus. But the prize went to Tacoma. This photo shows Tacoma's Union Station, which opened in 1911. And in that same year, privately owned ports would be forever changed in Washington. Reformers argued for public control of ports to ensure standardized rates and equal access to port facilities. With the opening of the Panama Canal on the horizon in 1914, engineers and city planners argued that only public ownership would allow for the type of development necessary for ports to claim their fair share of the coming increase in trade. Citizens lobbied for public control and access to ports. Their lobbying paid off. Legislators in the state government drafted a bill, the Port District Act, which, if adopted, would authorize public-run ports in the state. Strong support for public ownership of the ports came from farmers in Eastern Washington and longshore workers. The Port District Act passed by a vote of Washington state citizens in 1911. Seattle was the first port created under this act and became the first autonomous municipal corporation in the nation to develop port terminal operations and commerce development. The Port District Act gave power to independent government bodies run by a district, elected commissioners to operate the ports. A port district could be an entire county or a portion of one. And with voter approval, port districts could levy taxes, issue bonds, acquire property by eminent domain, and lease port-owned property to private owners. Not all public ports are on the water. Ports also operate airports, railroads, business parks, and industrial sites. But the basics set out in the Port District of 1911, now in the Revised Code of Washington, continues to guide ports in Washington state today, though the original act has been amended to expand the authority of ports. Perhaps the flaw in this act was that no government agency was tasked with overseeing or monitoring the actions of public ports. State law requires that port commissioners appoint an auditor. With the exception of an annual audit, the oversight of public ports falls on the shoulders of private citizens. Public ports are now an accepted part of states' government and economic life, but when they were first formed, they were radical and controversial. In the early 1900s, economic growth was booming in Thurston County, and the city of Olympia was expanding. Olympia's waterfront industries were prospering, but due to the limited land access to water, businesses developed on top of pilings. A major obstacle to growth were the shallow mud flats that surrounded the peninsula. Of course, at high tide, it wasn't such a problem for ships, but at low tide, even the small boats were beached in the mud. By the 1890s, it was obvious that if Olympia was to compete with Tacoma and Seattle for commerce, and if it was to accommodate the demand for lumber, especially after the San Francisco earthquake of 1906, a major dredging and filling operation would be required. Olympia's Mayor Doc Carla, rose to the occasion and raised private funds from Olympia residents, and they dredged the harbor. This created a deeper marine navigation channel for the ships, and the dredged fill created 29 blocks of land on the peninsula and on the eastern part of downtown. This new land opened development of a commercial district and for industries and railroads. And the pilings that you see on the left and the shorelines on the west would be filled by what today is known as the Carla fill. World War I marked a huge boost in demand for lumber and brought Olympia into the shipbuilding industry. A dozen ships were built for the war, but when the war ended, it all came to a close. This was the turning point that transitioned Olympia's privately owned port to a publicly owned port. In 1922, the Olympia City Chamber of Commerce supported the formation of a public port that could open up new economic opportunities. The measure was approved by a vote of Thurston County voters in the same year. And however, when the public voted to create a port district, they did not support a levy to fund it. So it was clear from the beginning that the port would mostly be expected to borrow and pay its own way. The three new port commissioners in 1922 envisioned a prosperous future. The harbor in Olympia, dominated by the lumber trade, included 30 lumber mills, 5 shingle mills, a veneer factory, and a cannery on the waterfront. In the photo on the right, you can see logs in East Bay waiting to be milled. From 1928 to 30, the port shipped more than 280 million board feet of lumber, record levels. And in 1929, about 224 vessels called at the Port of Olympia. Let's skip ahead in history to 1922. The port had its best decade, with only 35 ships at Olympia's port, of which 24 were Weyerhaeuser log ships, their only tenant. And as of July of this year, 2023, only 10 ships had called at the Port of Olympia. Back to the 1940s and 50s, high volumes of shipped lumber continued through World War II with the addition of canned fruit and vegetable exports. Wartime demand exposed a growing problem, however, the overcutting of timber. Local mills began to close after the 1950s. In addition, the Olympia Canning Company, a 40-year-old business at the port, also closed. Significant changes to the Deschutes estuary came in the 1950s, and these changes that occurred more than 70 years ago have significant ramifications at the port today, which you'll hear about a little bit later. For thousands of years, the Deschutes River flowed through a tidal estuary in Budd Inlet. This photo with its northern view shows the estuary and the channel of the Deschutes River. The arrow points to the Deschutes River as it's flowing under the 4th Avenue Bridge. And local efforts had long advocated making the mudflats more appealing by damming up the river. But the early architects of the Capitol campus, however, advocated for a tidal reflecting pool, but no dam or lake was ever mentioned in their plans. But forces were underway to create a lake. So in 1937, the legislature took its first action towards creation of what would become Capitol Lake. It purchased privately owned land in the Deschutes waterway. The circled area at the top there, though, shows the location of the lake today after the dam was constructed, with the Deschutes estuary below. Action to construct the lake was suspended at the onset of World War II, but after the war, the project moved forward and was completed in 1951. 7 years later, another major change was coming to the Olympia region. In 1958, construction was completed on the interstate highway through Tumwater and Olympia. And the red arrow you see at the bottom shows the freeway heading east, crossing the Deschutes River. The estuary was altered once again. The river flowing north was at one time 1,200 feet across, but it has been narrowed to about 150 feet to provide footings for the freeway. And the freeway would impact the port because trucks would now be moving goods north and south. Over its first 40 years, the port evolved from literally just being a port to being an industrial base. This photo illustrates how the Port Peninsula was dominated by industries employing hundreds of workers, not to mention workers in the mills and related businesses on the shores of Budd Inlet. The red arrow on the right there points to the location of what is today the Olympia Farmers Market. As the Olympia industrial phase wound down, the port looked south and purchased the Olympia Airport. Aircraft had operated as early as 1911 from a site in Tumwater known as the Bush Prairie Airfield Site. The flight of Lindbergh across the Atlantic in 1927 inspired the Olympia Chamber of Commerce to purchase the prairie land. And then the following year, the city of Olympia passed a bond issue to acquire the property. But it wasn't until 35 years later, in 1963, when a new port manager and a new comprehensive plan was in place, that the Port of Olympia expanded into air transportation with the purchase of the Olympia Airport from the city of Olympia. The port also took over land grants from the federal government that came with the airport, including what is now called the Newmarket Industrial Campus and the Tumwater Town Center. This property makes the port an important landholder in Tumwater, in addition to the airport itself. The milled lumber shipments and the related sawmill jobs ended in 1967. 3 plywood plants on the Port Peninsula had closed. However, the demand for unprocessed log exports was on the rise, and the old industries, the mills, and the creosote factory on the Port Peninsula were gone, but they left behind a legacy of pollution, including persistent and dangerous toxins like dioxin, petroleum, hydrocarbons, and even arsenic. Dioxin, by the way, is one of the most dangerous carcinogenic chemicals known, and it's in Budd Inlet today. With the shipping of logs, bark creates pollution when it enters the water via runoff from the Port Peninsula. So starting in the 1970s, the state legislature made cleanup a part of the mission of all public ports. That was a huge change, and it's still evolving. And you'll hear a little bit about the Budd Inlet cleanup later. By the 1960s, the industries on the Port Peninsula had closed, leaving only log shipments. So in the early 1970s, the port commissioners focused on the marine terminal and the navigation channel for the log shipments. And the channel was dredged to accommodate deep draft log ships. This dredge filled 54 acres of property, nearly a square mile to the east of the peninsula. The red line roughly shows the area that was filled. The port moved in a new direction when it decided to transition some of this new waterfront property to include recreation on the Port Peninsula. An entirely new look was coming to the port. This southern aerial view shows the Port Peninsula's transformation from the photo on the left in 1969 to the photo on the right from today. The red arrow on the right points to East Bay Marina, which was a project that we now know today as Swantown Marina. This was the first non-industrial port facility for Thurston County residents, and Swantown offers waterfront parks and a promenade trail. About 10 years later, after the completion of the Swantown Marina, the port constructed a public area known as the Port Plaza, mainly to attract businesses to port property. The Port Plaza is located on the west side of the Port Peninsula, south of the marine terminal, near the farmers market. The port has over time acquired a significant amount of property to become the largest property owner in the county. And this aerial view is looking south. The red arrows you see at the bottom on the right and left point to the significant amount of port property on the peninsula and its waterfront, such as the marine terminal, Port Plaza, and the Swantown Marina. And if you look at the arrow on the upper right, that's pointing to the area in Tumwater, the property that's now called Newmarket Industrial Campus and the Tumwater Town Center. And the red arrow just to the left of that is pointing to the Olympia Regional Airport. But if you look to the far left of this photo, you'll see an arrow pointing towards the Commerce Business Center in Lacey. So in 2017, the port purchased the Commerce Business Center, 3 industrial flex building spaces located in the Meridian campus area of Lacey. This is the port's first property investment in Lacey, and while managing inherited real estate near the airport and waterfront has long been a part of the port's mission, this Lacey real estate situation is a new port venture. You'll hear more about this shortly from John. Now I'd like to turn it over to John, who will offer some background on the issues of public concern about the Port of Olympia.
Hi, I'd like to highlight a number of concerns about the Port of Olympia that members of the public have identified over the past few years. Commissioners approved the purchase of the Lacey CBC buildings with the expectation that there would be an annual income of approximately $500,000 from the buildings. Commissioners were not informed of an analysis showing that the buildings required $1 million in required repairs, including roofing and heating and air conditioning. A market analysis completed 2 years after the purchase showed that the building's intended use had little market demand. The Lacey CBC buildings are home to a number of tenants, but there are empty spaces for lease. Costs, repair, maintenance, and debt far outweigh CBC rental income. Last year, in 2022, Port Commissioners appropriated nearly $450,000 to re-roof just one of the 3 buildings. 2 more re-roofing projects will be necessary at some point. These expenses raise questions about how the public benefits from the port as a real estate owner. Real estate speculation is a new port venture that deserves much deeper scrutiny. Log shipping by Weyerhaeuser accounts for about 80% of all activity at the marine terminal. Weyerhaeuser occupies some of the most valuable real estate on the Port Peninsula, leasing 24.5 acres, almost the entire north end of the peninsula. However, the marine terminal continues to be the largest money loser of all the port business units, in addition to being a source of pollution on Butt Inlet. The taxpayers of Thurston County have been subsidizing the log shipping operations at the port terminal for many years to the tune of $1 to $2 million on average per year. Why is the port losing so much money at the marine terminal? As you heard from Carla earlier in the presentation, shipping traffic at the port has declined significantly over the past several decades, from a high in the neighborhood of 250 vessels per year to our current situation in which we have maybe 20 to 30 ships per year. There are several other factors contributing to the loss at the marine terminal, which I'll discuss in a minute. To illustrate the port's loss, let's take a quick look at the proposed port budget for 2023. Overall, the port expects to lose $7.2 million on all combined operations. As you heard earlier, at least $1 to $2 million of that loss will be at the marine terminal. So the port depends on our property tax dollars to cover their losses and make ends meet. How much do we contribute to help the port make ends meet? So about $7.5 million. I think we need to ask ourselves, what public benefits are coming back to the citizens of Thurston for their tax dollars at the port? As mentioned earlier, there are a number of factors that contribute to the port's loss at the marine terminal. One primary reason that our port is not competitive with other ports further north is our location at the southernmost end of Puget Sound. The map demonstrates that the ports of Tacoma, Seattle, and Everett are much more accessible than the port of Olympia. In addition, large container ships, which are most profitable for shipping companies, are too massive to navigate past the port of Tacoma. They can't get through the Tacoma Narrows. The port of Tacoma is an example of what a modern deepwater port looks like today. This port can handle large container ships, which are the standard for profitable shipping in today's global market. No wonder the small port of Olympia, with its location on Puget Sound, is not competitive in the current environment of international shipping. Looking into the future, when the Deschutes Estuary Restoration Project removes the Fifth Avenue Dam, silt from the Deschutes River will flow into Butt Inlet and impact the port, the Olympia Yacht Club, and Swantown Marina. The red arrow points north to the Fifth Avenue Dam. The port is currently making efforts to ensure payment for future dredging through 2050 from its partners in the Deschutes Estuary Project. Therefore, it is improbable that a deepwater terminal is sustainable without significant local taxpayer, state, and federal grant subsidies once the Fifth Avenue Dam is removed. It is reasonable for us to assume that this will put an unbearable burden on taxpayers now and in the future. Estimates for continued dredging exceed hundreds of millions of dollars. This is a satellite view of the Port Peninsula. On the right is East Bay, and on the left is West Bay. At the bottom of the slide is downtown Olympia. We obtained this image from the Department of Ecology. The purple areas are the hotspots, the most polluted areas surrounding the Port Peninsula. The port is in the initial stages of developing a state-mandated cleanup of legacy pollution in Butt Inlet that has a price tag of about $190 million. Currently, engineers propose to deposit the contaminated dredged material mixed with cement on top of the Port Peninsula, thereby saving the cost of transporting contaminated material. The plan will raise the height of the peninsula to protect against sea level rise. As logical as this all seems, there are some serious questions about this plan. The port's proposed cleanup plan ignores current pollution sources in the inlet. Surface dioxin contamination in Butt Inlet indicates it is likely legacy pollution from the former creosote plant, Cascade Pole. Dioxin is one of the most biologically damaging chemicals known. These current sources of pollution need to be addressed, or the bay will be recontaminated after the cleanup is completed. The port is ignoring basic science in the proposed plan of cleanup and have not brought scientists to the table to advise them. This plan will cost the taxpayers millions of dollars, and it will not restore the inlet and marine habitat as promised by the port. Rather than a cleanup and restoration project for Butt Inlet, the port's underlying goal seems to be to use state and federal funding to maintain the navigation channel for the marine terminal, the Olympia Yacht Club, and Swantown Marina. This will only serve corporate and private interests and will continue business as usual at the marine terminal. Here is an aerial view of the Port Peninsula. Vision 2050 represents the Port's most comprehensive public engagement initiative to date. Adopted by the Port Commission in 2019, it presents a new opportunity for the Port's focus to align with community priorities. Destination Waterfront is one initiative of Vision 2050 that focuses on developing the east side and north end of the Port Peninsula. The red arrows point to the areas included in Destination Waterfront. In Vision 2050, the top-ranking preferences for the Port Peninsula were for open spaces, recreation and access to the water, a community hub and tourist destination. People said they wanted to be able to walk and fish and swim and kayak. In a subsequent survey, a living shoreline was a top priority. It's the responsibility of the Port Commissioners to keep a close watch on the development of this project. As the Port plans Destination Waterfront, Commissioners should protect the preferences of stakeholders as clearly stated in the Vision 2050 report. The Port property includes the Newmarket Industrial Campus in Tumwater. Located south of Tumwater Boulevard and west of the Olympia Regional Airport, over 700 acres were given to the Port through federal land grants that came with the airport. Development proposals for the Port's Tumwater property have caused much public concern in recent years. The Panattoni project, a mega warehouse to be constructed on leased Port property in this area, has been opposed strongly by our local progressive environmental community. Concerns over loss of tree canopy, building in a flood area, loss of habitat for endangered species, increased truck traffic, higher air pollution, and negative health impacts, particularly on a nearby residential neighborhood and a middle school, did not stop the Port of Olympia from approving the Panattoni warehouse developments. The photos on the right are what we expect to see in this area. Swire is another development project on 95 acres of leased property approved by the commissioners at the airport that was also strongly opposed by our local progressive environmental community. While Swire Coca-Cola, a Chinese-owned company, made the presentation that sold Port commissioners on the project, the company that is listed on the lease is Swire Land, and there is no mention of a Coca-Cola plant. However, the city of Tumwater has recklessly promised water use rights to Swire Land. Perhaps the most egregious issue in the Swire lease is the loss of vulnerable habitat for one federally protected and two state protected endangered species. Also, the troubling fact that the lease option extends for a period of 75 years until 2097, and the public has no idea what Swire's real intentions are. Noise pollution, leaded aviation fuel, potential expansion of expanded cargo flights from burgeoning warehouse development are all major concerns about the airport. The airport has taken significant acreage and many homes from nearby neighborhoods by eminent domain, despite master plans promising no such expansion plans. There has been a lack of transparency and inclusion of the public in the Port's decision-making process. Unlike the county that holds public hearings on important issues, public hearings with Port commissioners are rarely, if ever, held. This attitude goes against Section 30, the revised Code of Washington for officers and agencies, that says, and I quote, "The people insist on remaining informed so that they may maintain control over the instruments they have created. The people in delegating authority do not give their public servants the right to decide what is good for the people to know and what is not good for them to know," end quote. It's important that we select Port commissioners who will provide adequate information to the public, include the public in its decision-making process, and protect the environment. Carla?
Yes, I'd like to talk a little bit about what to consider when voting for a Port candidate. First, let's ask ourselves, we have an opportunity this November to to help the port turn the tide from a long run of poor business decisions, serving corporate and private interests and ignoring the public, to a port that serves all the citizens in Thurston County, is a good environmental steward of public property, and addresses climate change. 3 basic questions we might want to ask port candidates include: how will you protect the environment? How will you as commissioners spend our tax dollars? And how will you support all Thurston County residents? Well, good port commissioners will make science-based decisions that address climate change and cleanup and the restoration of Bud Inlet. They will use the $7.5 million of public tax dollars to benefit all residents of Thurston County, such as supporting countywide broadband, and this is the affordable high-speed internet. They will study and follow meaningful public planning documents and activities such as Vision 2050, the Newmarket Industrial Campus Master Plan, and the Deschutes Estuary Restoration Project. They will help the port to be a good land-owning neighbor in Thurston County instead of speculating primarily for port benefits. And they will encourage the public input and support transparency in how the port governs. They will encourage meaningful public input into revising the airport master plan and defend local community interests in the regional airport planning. Good port commissioners will transition the port to non-polluting operations such as solar and wind, and help to expand the broadband, and to provide well-paid family jobs and operations that contribute to the county's infrastructure. They will support local agriculture and local farmers, and they will strive to make the waterfront at Bud Inlet a clean and inviting place for all to enjoy. Port commissioners have an important role in protecting our natural resources. In addition to restoring the marine habitat in Bud Inlet, the port has a responsibility of environmental stewardship to protect tree canopy, watersheds, and critical habitat for vulnerable species on all port properties. You are looking at a map of the 5 Thurston County districts, which correspond to the 5 port districts. The districts were increased from 3 to 5 through a countywide vote in 2022. And this map shows the 2 new districts, that is District 4, the light blue in the South County, and the District 5, dark blue in the Northeast. The arrow points to the 3 districts, 1, 4, and 5, with port candidates running in the upcoming general election. 2 candidates are running in each of those 3 districts. You'll be voting for 1 candidate in each district, a total of 3 new port commissioners. And now John will give an introduction to all the port candidates.
In District 1, the 2 candidates are Jasmine Savada and Bill McGregor. Bill McGregor, a former port commissioner, is business as usual at the port. And what I mean by business as usual is continuing to support failing operations like the marine terminal, environmentally damaging development projects such as the Panatone project, failure to protect the environment until forced to do so by costly lawsuits, and making poor money-losing investment decisions such as the Lacey Commerce Center, the big crane at the marine terminal, and the fuel dock. Jasmine, on the other hand, represents positive change and a forward-looking vision for the port, and she is the candidate we support for District 1. Jasmine is a graduate of Harvard University, and she holds a law degree from UW. She was formerly employed as a Director of Legislative Affairs at the Washington Department of Commerce. Significantly, she served as counsel to the Washington House of Representatives Office of Program Research from 2013 to 2016. So she has the connections and the understanding of the legislature that will be a great asset to the commission should she be elected. We believe that she would be a proponent for sustainable economic growth because this has been a focus for her at the Department of Commerce. Her significant endorsements include Beth Dolio, Jessica Bateman, Sam Hunt, and TJ Johnson. The 2 candidates for District 4 are Maggie Sanders and Rose Gunderson. Rose Gunderson is another business as usual candidate. We support Maggie Sanders in District 4. She is a Native American and a member of the Makah tribe and resides in Tenino. Maggie is strongly committed to environmental stewardship, social justice, and equitable inclusion. She has both a bachelor's and a master's degree from Evergreen State College, and among her many qualifications, she is certified by FEMA in natural disaster preparedness, an equal opportunity mediator, and a NASA ambassador at the Marine Services Division. And as representative of the 4th District, she will be a strong advocate for the services to support our struggling agricultural community. Maggie has said that her top priorities will be environmental stewardship, fiscal responsibility, transparency in government, and democratic accountability. Among Maggie's endorsements are former Port Commissioner E.J. Zeta, the Native American Caucus of Washington State Democrats, and several local labor unions. The District 5 race pits Sarah Tong against Troy Kirby. We support Sarah Tong. Again, Troy Kirby represents the entrenched interest at the port. However, if Sarah prevails, she will bring a fresh, youthful perspective to the Port Commission. She has 11 years of experience in various roles in information technology and is currently a technical support supervisor. Sarah is a committed progressive leader who promises to work to protect our environment and the well-being of all community members over the special interests. Among her key endorsements are E.J. Zeta, Ty Menser, Robin Vasquez, and Carolyn Cox.
2 of the 3 current Port District Commissioners will continue their 4-year tenure through 2025. They are Bob Isle in District 2 and Amy Evans Harding in District 3. We hope that the information presented here has helped to inform you about the critical issues at the port and will assist you in making informed choices about port candidates when you receive your ballot to vote in the upcoming election. You and other voters of Thurston County will determine who fills the commissioner seats in District 1, 4, and 5. Remember, you must return your ballot by November 7th. And if you'd like to contact us, if you have any questions, please feel free to email us at portforthepeople@gmail.com. Thank you.